Welcome to the Shadow Archive. We are opening the drawers of history that would have been better left locked. Whether the following reports depict historical facts or merely document the distorted perception of an overburdened mind remains unclear. We merely examine the papers that have been passed down to us. The Lower Saxony State Archive in Hanover guards an unassuming bundle of gray cardboard boxes in its deepest, climate-controlled magazines under the signature 218F. The cover pages bear the dry, unsuspicious title, Routine Inspection of the Waldhaus Educational Institution, November 1956. These files do not document criminal gangs, hostile spies, or blatant atrocities. They reveal something far more subtle and terrifying: the perfect hiding place of a predator amidst the rigid, untouchable architecture of a state apparatus. To understand the events in the Harz Mountains, one must understand the spirit of those years. The young federal republic of the 1950s longed for structure, unconditional obedience, and a clean facade. Female adolescents who defied this norm, whether through backtalk, petty theft, or a lifestyle deemed immoral, were swiftly and silently removed from the streets by the Youth Welfare Office. The State Board assigned them to homes where discipline and order were meant to straighten out their supposedly defective characters. The Waldhaus was one such facility. It lay deep within the dense, damp, coniferous forests of the Upper Harz, miles away from the nearest paved road. A massive three-story brick building from the imperial era, its narrow windows sitting like black slits in the red facade. There were no fences and no walls around the property. The isolation was purely geographical. The dark, impenetrable forest formed a natural prison that stifled any escape in its infancy. In the late afternoon of November 14, 1956, the young medical officer Dr. Martin Kretschmer reached the home. His mission was mundane: a routine inspection of the sanitary facilities and the formal confirmation of the staff's health certificates. Kretschmer's private notebooks, which accompany the official report, however, paint a picture of an extreme, unnatural anomaly from the very first minute. Immediately after passing through the heavy oak portal, Kretschmer was hit by the typical biting smell of floor wax, strong curd soap, and overcooked cabbage. But what gave him immediate pause was the complete absence of noise. According to the official register, the Waldhaus housed 72 girls between the ages of 14 and 21 at the time. A building of this size, filled with over 70 young people, is inevitably filled with a certain acoustic baseline: the scraping of chairs, the clattering of dishes, whispers in the hallways, or the distant echo of footsteps on stone floors. Here, however, a tomb-like, vacuumous silence prevailed. Kretschmer noted that the ticking of his own wristwatch in the reception hall seemed inappropriately loud and intrusive. He was received by the director of the facility, Helene von Schutz. Her personnel files describe her as a woman in her mid-50s, formerly a head nurse in a military hospital, unmarried, and of impeccable official reputation. She was a tall, gaunt figure in a strictly buttoned-up gray suit. Her face was a mask-like surface of politeness, absolutely motionless, and characterized by an icy, calculated friendliness. She did not lead the medical officer into a reception parlor, but directly into her Spartan administration office. There, she presented him with the leather-bound main register without further ado. Her movements were precise, efficient, and completely devoid of emotion. Kretschmer, a man of systematic meticulousness, did not begin his official tour by inspecting the premises, but by checking the numbers. He compared the official assignments from the Youth Welfare Office with the home's current inventory book. The audit initially seemed flawless. Admissions, discharges, and daily food rations were entered in neat, sharp handwriting. But Kretschmer's trained eye stumbled upon a bureaucratic detail in the back section of the register. In the column for departures, there were noticeably many entries over the last 6 months with the note transferred due to disciplinary inadequacy. The files stated that these specific girls had been transferred to closed psychiatric institutions or stricter correctional facilities. That in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the absolute absence of official counterstamps. When a ward of the state was transferred, it imperatively required the transport request, the signature of the accompanying gendarme, and the admission confirmation from the destination facility. In Director von Schutz's files, however, the The paper trail of these girls ended abruptly on the day of their supposed transfer. They left the Waldhaus on paper, but never appeared in any other state register again. When Kretschmer carefully asked about the missing carbon copies of the transport protocols, not a muscle twitched in the director's face. She explained in a quiet, instructive voice that these documents had been sent to the Central Archive in Hanover at the end of the quarter, as per routine, a formal, barely contestable bureaucratic excuse. But the true crack in the perfect facade of the Waldhaus was revealed to Kretschmer only minutes later. Director von Schutz excused herself briefly to have the janitor called for the upcoming tour. Kretschmer used the unobserved moment, stepped out of the office, and cast a glance into the adjacent, dimly lit staff cloakroom. There, carefully lined up on a dusty shelf, stood half a dozen cheap cardboard suitcases and tied bundles. They were the typical, meager belongings with which the girls were delivered by the Youth Welfare Office. A yellowed cardboard luggage tag hung from one of the bundles. Kretschmer read the name in the pale light of the hallway lamp. Clara M. It was exactly the name he had read less than 5 minutes earlier in the main register under the departures. According to the director's neat handwriting, Clara M. had been transferred to an institution in southern Germany over 3 months ago. No girl who is transferred to another facility leaves behind her only suitcase containing her remaining personal belongings. A cold shiver of certainty washed over the medical officer. The girls did not leave the Waldhaus. They vanished. And the bureaucratic coldness of this house was not a means of education, but the silent cloak for an unimaginable methodical erasure. Before Kretschmer could even straighten the tag again, he heard the quiet, rhythmic clicking of heels on the stone floor behind him. Director von Schutz stood in the doorframe. Her face lay in the shadows, but her voice cut through the dead silence of the hallway like a surgical scalpel. If you have concluded the formal inspection, Doctor, I would now like to present my wards to you. You will find that they are exceedingly obedient. Part 2. The discipline of the prey. The tour of the Waldhaus began at exactly 4:30 p.m. Dr. Kretschmer followed the director through the long, sparsely lit corridors of the main building. The architectural concept of the home was designed for absolute surveillance. There were no blind spots, no alcoves, and no doors that could be locked from the inside. The walls were painted chest-high, with a washable, toxic green oil paint. Above that extended bare gray plaster. Helene von Schutz first led the medical officer into the workroom on the ground floor. When she opened the heavy double doors, Kretschmer was presented with a scene that he later described in his notes as the absolute silent capitulation of the human spirit. The hall was a massive, cool room with high, barred arched windows through which the fading light of the late November afternoon fell. A total of 48 young women sat at 4 long, parallel wooden tables. They wore identical, coarse drill dresses in a washed-out gray. Their hair was, without exception, tied back into tight, short braids at the nape of the neck to stifle any individual expression in the bud. No one looked up as the doctor and the director entered. Not an eyelash twitched, not a head turned even a millimeter. Kretschmer was familiar with the usual occupational measures in state correctional facilities. He expected sewing, darning socks, folding laundry, or simple cardboard manufacturing, activities that possessed at least a rudimentary economic or motor benefit. But there were no fabrics and no paper on the tables. In front of each girl lay a considerable pile of washed, gray pebbles and a smaller pile of white pebbles. The inmate's task apparently consisted of sorting the white stones by minute-size differences and placing them into tiny wooden-type cases. The only sound in the entire immense hall was the steady, dry clacking of stone on wood. Grasp, examine, place. Grasp, examine, place. An endless, flawless machinery of flesh and bone. Kretschmer stepped up to the row of tables. He observed the girls' hands. They moved in a perfect, automated rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. When he asked the director in a hushed voice about the pedagogical purpose of this specific work, von Schutz slowly turned her head toward him. Her gaze was completely empty. "There is no purpose, Doctor," she answered in a monotonous, instructive tone. "The stones are mixed together again by the staff in the evening and distributed anew the next morning. Meaningful work creates a sense of creation. Creation nourishes pride. and pride is the root of rebellion. This task here creates nothing. It merely teaches the girls the absolute futility of their own will. Whoever surrenders their will becomes docile, and docility is the first step toward permanent peace. Kretschmer shivered. This was no longer a state educational measure. This was the methodical breaking of resistance. It was the tactic of a predator that does not chase its prey, but drives it into complete apathy through endless, grueling exhaustion until it surrenders unresistingly to the inevitable. The doctor noticed that the faces of the young women were completely rigid. They did not appear relaxed, but frozen in a permanent, silent panic. The Iron House rules punished every minor transgression, every clearing of the throat, and every unprompted movement with draconian measures. The pressure of the invisible surveillance weighed so heavily on the room that even the girls' breathing was extremely shallow and synchronous. The route continued to the dormitories on the second floor. Here, too, the geometry of coercion reigned. 32 iron bed frames stood at exactly measured intervals of 80 centimeters from one another. There were no nightstands, no pictures, no mirrors. Any reflection of their own identity had been eradicated from this room. The wool blankets were folded with such military precision that they looked as if they were carved from stone, while Director von Schutz remained standing at the head of the hall to check the correct alignment of the window latches. Kretschmer slowly walked down the narrow aisle between the rows of beds. He pretended to inspect the mattresses for vermin. In truth, he was looking for any sign of life, for proof that these girls were still human beings and not mere shells. He reached the bed with the sewn-on inventory number 44. At the foot of the bed kneeled a girl, perhaps 17 years old, scrubbing the already spotlessly clean wooden floor with a stiff bristle brush. Her gaze was fixed rigidly downward. Kretschmer stopped directly beside her. He deliberately dropped his pen. The silver fountain pen rolled across the floorboards and came to a stop exactly in front of number 44's knees. The girl paused her movement. The director was still standing at the other end of the hall, her back turned to them. For a fraction of a second, number 44 lifted her head. Kretschmer looked into eyes that were widened by such a deep, elemental fear of death that it took his breath away. It was a silent, deafening scream. Her hand twitched forward. She picked up the pen to hand it to the doctor. But as her fingers brushed Kretschmer's hand, she didn't just press the cold metal of the fountain pen into his palm. She pressed a tiny, damp, and tightly crumpled scrap of paper into his hand. She immediately lowered her head again and resumed the rhythmic, mechanical scrubbing of the floor, as if nothing had happened. The movement was so fluid and rehearsed that the director, when she turned around the very next moment, could not notice the slightest irregularity. "Is everything to your satisfaction, doctor?" Helene von Schutz's voice echoed through the empty dormitory. Kretschmer let the scrap of paper disappear deep into his coat pocket, cleared his throat, and gave a curt nod. "The hygiene regulations are being exemplarily observed, Director." It was only hours later, when the Waldhaus sank into the oppressive darkness of the harsh night and Kretschmer was isolated in his Spartan guest room in the West Wing, that he dared to pull the note from his pocket. He unfolded the rough gray paper under the weak light of a small bedside lamp. It was a torn edge from a soap wrapper. The writing on it was shaky, evidently scribbled in haste with a secretly pilfered piece of coal. It was not a message. It was not a plea for help. It was merely 2 lines that made the blood freeze in Kretschmer's veins. Clara M., August 12th, East Wing does not burn. The date was exactly 3 days before Clara's supposed transfer date recorded in the register. And the East Wing. The East Wing, according to the home's official architectural plans, had been completely sealed off and locked due to the risk of collapse following a boiler room fire in 1951. Kretschmer looked at his watch. It was 11:14 p.m. The building lay in absolute, dead silence. The inspector knew that the official records were a lie. To find the truth, he had to break the rules of the Waldhaus. He had to enter the East Wing. The darkness in the Waldhaus was of an almost physical density. When Dr. Martin Kretschmer soundlessly opened the door to his guest room at 11:40 p.m., the icy cold of the unheated hallways hit him. The house rules dictated that the coal stoves be throttled after 8 p.m. It was another measure of discipline. Those who are freezing do not waste energy on insubordinate thoughts. Kretschmer moved through the west wing in the pale beam of his narrow flashlight. His first destination was not the locked east wing, but the director's administration office. As a medical officer, he knew that monsters are rarely born in dark basements. They emerge in the seamless cracks of bureaucracy. If Helene von Schutz was making girls disappear, there had to be a financial and logistical trail. The door to the office was secured only by a simple warded lock. An arrogance of power, the director feared no oversight in her own isolated realm. With a flat lockpick Kretschmer had carried since his days as a field medic, the deadbolt could be slid back silently. The room smelled of cold pipe tobacco and floor wax. Kretschmer drew the heavy curtains before shining the light of his flashlight on the massive oak desk. He ignored the official leather register he had been presented with that afternoon and searched the lower, locked drawers. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath stacks of old service regulations, he found a ledger bound in gray linen. It bore no official government stamp. It was the private accounting book of the Waldhaus. Kretschmer opened the book and compared the numbers in the cone of his flashlight. The cold that crept up on him in that moment had nothing to do with the room temperature. The bare numbers told a story of industrial, precise extermination. The state of Lower Saxony paid the Waldhaus monthly food allowances and heating subsidies for exactly 72 inmates. The official register reflected this number, but the gray ledger documented the actual purchases from the wholesalers in Goslar. The deliveries of flour, potatoes, cabbage, and coal briquettes mathematically could never suffice for 72 adolescent women. The amount of calories the house actually purchased was enough for a maximum of 45 people. Even factoring in a drastic, intentional malnutrition to discipline the girls, a massive amount of raw materials was missing. The conclusion was as simple as it was horrific. The vanished girls, who were transferred on paper, were no longer eating. They were no longer consuming coal. The director was collecting state subsidies for ghosts. Kretschmer flipped hastily to the personnel files of the affected girls. He looked for Clara M. and the other departures of the recent months. As he compared their family backgrounds, he recognized the predator's pattern. Every single girl who had been untraceably transferred shared the exact same profile: complete orphans, illegitimate children with no known father, whose mothers had died, wards of the state whom no lawyer, no priest, and no relative would ever care about. They were societal flotsam left to the Waldhaus. They were the perfect victims, because their absence from the world would leave no void that anyone would ever notice. Kretschmer closed the gray book and shoved it into his wide coat pocket. It was the legal proof of large-scale subsidy fraud. But fraud did not explain what had happened to the girls' bodies. He left the office and oriented himself eastward in the pitch-black main corridor. The path to the east wing led through a vaulted gallery whose windows were blind with frost. At the end of the gallery loomed a massive iron fire door. A faded, enameled sign warned, "Restricted area. Fire hazard. Keep out." According to the Youth Welfare Office's official building records, this wing had been severely damaged by a coal fire in the cellars in 1951. The ceilings were considered in danger of collapse, the premises unusable. Kretschmer stepped close to the steel door. He shined his light on the floor. When a section of a building is sealed for 5 years, an inevitably thick, undisturbed layer of dust and dirt gathers in front of it. The stone floor in front of this door, however, was spotlessly clean. There were fine, crescent-shaped drag marks on the tiles, the unmistakable sign of a heavy door being regularly opened and closed. He ran his fingertips over the massive, wrought iron hinges. They were not eaten away by rust. They were thickly smeared with fresh, dark machine grease. "East wing does not burn." The words of inmate number 44 echoed in Kretschmer's mind. He placed both hands flat on the cold metal and pushed. The door was not locked. Completely soundless, as if muffled by the thick grease, the heavy wing glided inward, revealing a pitch-black corridor. As Kretschmer took his first step over the threshold, he expected the typical bitter smell of old ash and burnt wood. But the air in the east wing was ice cold, extremely dry, and completely free of any burning odor. Instead, he was hit by a chemical, biting sharpness that was all too familiar to him as a doctor. It smelled of formaldehyde, high-proof alcohol, and harsh bleach. It didn't smell like a ruined building. It smelled like a clinical pathology lab. The inspector clicked off his flashlight. At the end of the dark corridor, deep in the belly of the supposedly destroyed wing, a faint yellowish strip of light flickered from beneath a door crack. The fine, yellowish strip of light at the end of the corridor cut like a razor blade through the absolute darkness of the east wing. Dr. Martin Kretschmer moved silently toward the slit of light. With every step on the cold stone tiles, the biting smell of formaldehyde, phenol, and high-proof alcohol grew more intense. It was the unmistakable sterile stench of finality. Kretschmer reached the door. It was not made of wood, but of solid, white-painted steel, the kind found in the cold storage rooms of large city hospitals. It was not locked, but stood slightly ajar. The medical officer pressed his flat hand against the cool metal. The door swung open absolutely silently, revealing a room that made a mockery of any claim of a destroyed, unusable building wing. It was not a fire ruin, it was architectural and hygienic perfection. The room measured about 8 by 8 meters. The walls and floor were seamlessly covered with bright white square tiles. The floor had a slight incline that led exactly to the center of the room to a wide cast-iron drain grate. The ceiling was equipped with powerful fluorescent tubes that cast a harsh, shadowless, and unnatural light into every corner. In the center of this blindingly white vacuum stood a massive autopsy table made of brushed stainless steel. The surface was deeply grooved to drain fluids precisely. Next to it were rolling instrument tables made of chrome. Arranged on them with surgical precision were no pedagogical tools. There were scalpels, bone saws, rib shears, and long hollow trocars, the kind used for draining bodily fluids. The true extent of the officially shielded monstrosity, however, was on the walls. The left and right flanks of the room were occupied by floor-to-ceiling, iron heavy-duty shelving. In them stood dozens, perhaps hundreds, of massive, cylindrical apothecary jars. Each jar was filled with a clear, slightly yellowish liquid. Kretschmer stepped up to the first shelf, holding his breath. As a pathologist, he immediately recognized what lay before him, but his human mind resisted the ice-cold, systematic reality of the sight. Human specimens floated in the jars. Lungs neatly separated from the bronchi. Perfectly preserved hearts, livers, and kidneys. It was not a bloody, chaotic slaughterhouse. It was a flawless clinical library of the human body. A meticulous typewritten label was affixed to every single jar. Kretschmer read the inscriptions in the harsh neon light. Inventory number 18. Lung. Right. Date, March 4th, 1956. Condition, free of defect. Inventory number 29. Heart muscle. Date, May 17, 1956. Condition, complete silence. Then his gaze fell upon a particularly large jar at eye level. The label bore fresh ink. Clara M. August 12, 1956. Complete preparation. Condition, absolute docility. Director Helene von Schutz did not kill the defenseless girls in the heat of the moment. She did not punish them out of rage. She cured them. In her twisted, narcissistic ideology of absolute order, the living, pulsating, and irrational body of the young women was a blemish, a structural defect. Only through death, complete draining, and chemical preservation in a formalin bath did the girls achieve the state the director revered most: eternal, silent, and flawless perfection. They were now objects. They did not contradict. They did not cry. They no longer consumed state resources. They were the perfect end product of the Waldhaus doctrine. Kretschmer turned away, fighting down the rising nausea. His gaze fell on the far end of the room. There sat a large, white enameled bathtub, covered with a heavy rubber tarp. The outlines beneath the tarp left no doubt as to what or who was waiting for the next stage of preservation. The doctor pulled his small notebook from his pocket to hastily copy the dates from the labels. He needed this gapless list as irrefutable proof for the public prosecutor's office. The ledger alone was not enough for this abyss. His pen scratched frantically across the paper, the only sound in the oppressive, chemically pure silence of the pathology lab. Then Kretschmer froze. The scratching of his pen was suddenly no longer the only sound. From the pitch-black corridor behind him came the extremely quiet, yet unmistakable, steady clicking of high heels on stone tiles. The sound drew closer, calm, unagitated, and in a perfect military cadence. Kretschmer spun around and looked into the dark hallway. The clicking stopped exactly at the threshold of the light. A gaunt silhouette slowly pushed itself into the doorframe. Her face was half in shadow, but Director von Schutz's icy, instructive voice filled the sterile room. "You made the mistake of looking for meaning, Doctor?" she said monotonously, as her hand slowly slid toward the heavy iron deadbolt on the inside of the massive steel door. "I had hoped you would appreciate the quiet of my house. Now, I fear, I must familiarize you with my methodology." With a deafening, metallic bang, the heavy clinical door slammed shut. The turning of the massive deadbolt sealed the trap. The deafening, metallic bang of the massive deadbolt echoed off the white-tiled walls of the pathology lab, suffocating any hope of a mistaken joke. Dr. Martin Kretschmer dropped his notebook. He lunged at the door and threw his entire body weight against the cool, white-painted steel. The door did not yield a single millimeter. It was designed for the isolation of infectious corpses. It was built to let neither air nor sound escape. At eye level was a narrow, thick-glassed viewing window, threaded with fine wire mesh. On the other side of the glass, in the dim light of the corridor, the face of Director Helene von Schutz appeared. Her features were completely relaxed. There was no triumph in her gaze, no raging fury, and no sadistic grin. She observed the medical officer with exactly the same detached, objective expression with which she had previously inspected the girl's folded wool blankets. Kretschmer pressed his face against the cool glass. "This is false imprisonment," he shouted, though his own voice sounded unpleasantly shrill and helpless in the tiled room. "The Hanover Public Prosecutor's Office knows I am here. If I don't report back tomorrow, the gendarmerie will tear this house apart stone by stone." Helene von Schutz tilted her head slightly to the side. She pressed a small button next to the doorframe, activating a hidden intercom embedded in the masonry. Her voice penetrated the inside of the cell, tinny and distorted, but with a terrifying calmness. "The public prosecutor's office, doctor, is exclusively interested in forms that have been filled out correctly and filed on time," she lectured quietly. "You overestimate the care of the apparatus. No one will look for you." An eager, young medical officer who drives his car off a cliff on the icy, unlit roads of the Upper Hartz in November. A regrettable tragedy. They will find your charred remains in a ravine, and the Waldhaus will dedicate a modest but tasteful wreath to you. Kretschmer took a step back. The cold of the room now seemed to penetrate through his clothing straight to his bones. He looked around hastily. There were no windows. The walls were solid. The only connection to the outside world was this small piece of bulletproof glass and the tinny voice of a madwoman. "You are completely insane," Kretschmer blurted out. His gaze fell on the cylindrical jars on the heavy-duty shelves, in which the preserved organs of the vanished girls floated in the yellowish formalin solution. This is not the work of an educator. You are a monster." A quiet, joyless laugh came through the speaker. "A monster? Please, doctor, look at my work without this hypocritical, bourgeois sentimentality." The director's face leaned closer to the glass until her eyes filled the entire hatch. "What did the state send me? The outcasts, the defectives, girls who steal, who lie, who sell themselves on the street. They carry the seed of moral and structural decay within them. The lives of these creatures are nothing more than a chaotic, unpredictable ulcer on the body of society. The state does not want to cure them. It merely wants them out of sight." She paused, as if giving a slow-witted student time to internalize the lesson. I, doctor, do not merely put them out of sight. I perfect them. Look around you. Breath is the enemy of order. It produces words, and words produce lies. The beating heart is a muscle driven by base, animal instincts. Only when you stop this faulty machine, clean it, and halt the decay, does the flesh achieve its true, eternal flawlessness. In these jars, there is no more disobedience. There is no pain, no lies, no hysteria. I grant these girls the absolute perfect silence that life denied them. In that moment, Kretschmer recognized the cruel perfection of her madness. Helene von Schütz did not kill out of base bloodlust. She viewed herself as the final radical authority of the state's cleansing machinery. To her, dissection was not violence, but a bureaucratic act of ultimate discipline. And me? Kretschmer asked, his mind racing to find a way out. His eyes wandered over the spotless surgical instruments on the rolling table. Will you put me in formalin as well? You are not a ward of the state, Dr. Kretschmer. Your preparation would raise too many questions, the director replied matter-of-factly. You will merely be a regrettable traffic accident. Until I have made the logistical preparations for your disappearance, you will come to know the benefits of isolation. I expect you to remain quiet. With a sharp click, she turned off the intercom. At the exact same moment, the glaring fluorescent tubes on the ceiling went out. The room was plunged into total, inky black darkness. The only thing that remained was the quiet, monotonous hum of the exhaust fan on the ceiling. The director's face disappeared from the hatch. Kretschmer heard the regular hard footsteps of her heels on the stone floor of the corridor, slowly fading away until they were finally swallowed by the heavy fire door of the east wing. Kretschmer stood alone in the absolute darkness of the pathology lab. The temperature seemed to drop further. The biting smell of the preservatives crept into his nose and burned in his lungs. He knew that the floating, silent remains of the girls were resting on the shelves around him. He clicked his narrow flashlight back on. The weak, trembling cone of light cut through the dark and cast grotesque, gigantic shadows of the preserving jars onto the tiled walls. Kretschmer had to get out of here. If von Schütz returned, she would not come alone, and she would undoubtedly be prepared to dispose of him. He hurried over to the rolling instrument table and grabbed the most massive object he could find, a heavy, steel rib shear. He wanted to try to pry open the hinges of the viewing hatch, or smash the glass, even though he knew how futile that was with bulletproof glass. As he turned around with the shears in his hand, the beam of his flashlight glided across the far end of the room. It stopped at the large white enameled bathtub, which was covered with the heavy rubber tarp. Kretschmer held his breath. In his haste, he had assumed that a corpse lay beneath the tarp, waiting for preparation. A dead, stiffened girl. But when the cone of light hit the gray rubber surface, the doctor saw something that made the blood freeze in his veins. The tarp was moving. It was not a fast, panicked movement. It was an extremely slow, shallow, and rhythmic rising and falling. An unnaturally shallow breath. Kretschmer lowered the rib shears and approached the tub with slow, hesitant steps. The stench of disinfectant was strongest here. With trembling fingers, he grabbed the edge of the heavy tarp and pulled it back with a jerk. The glaring light of his flashlight fell upon the face of inmate number 44. The girl who had slipped him the note lay naked on the cold enamel of the tub. Her arms and legs were strapped to massive metal eyelets with thick leather belts, but the most horrifying thing was not her bindings. It was the absolute paralysis of her body. Her skin was chalk white, her pupils extremely dilated. As a doctor, Kretschmer immediately recognized the symptoms. She was not unconscious. Director von Schütz had injected her with a massive dose of a muscle relaxant, probably curare or a highly concentrated synthetic derivative. Number 44 was fully conscious. She felt the cold, she saw the light, she recognized the doctor, but she could not move a single muscle. She could not speak, could not scream, and could not flee. She was buried alive within her own body, laid out and strapped down, waiting in the darkness for the director's scalpel to make the final cut. A single, silent tear ran slowly down the girl's cheek and mixed with the cold dampness of the enamel tub. In that moment, Kretschmer knew that it was no longer just about his own survival. If he did not break open this cell before dawn, the accounting of the vanished would grow by yet another entry. The survival instinct is a primitive, chaotic force that does not adhere to official directives. In the pitch-black, ice-cold pathology lab of the Waldhaus, Dr. Martin Kretschmer knew he had only a few minutes left before Director von Schutz put her threat into action. He faced the terrible task of freeing not only himself, but also the paralyzed body of inmate number 44 from a cell that had been constructed for absolute eternity. Kretschmer tore open the leather restraining straps binding the girl to the enamel tub with the heavy steel rib shears. Number 44 fell against his chest like a clumsy mannequin. The curare derivative blocked every motor function. She was a pure, silent weight of barely 50 kilograms, her heart beating shallowly and in panic. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. The quiet hum of the exhaust fan on the ceiling turned into an irregular, deep rumble. A sharp, acrid smell penetrated through the fine ventilation slits of the massive steel door, which had nothing to do with clinical preservatives anymore. It smelled of burning kerosene and melting linoleum. Helene von Schutz had no intention of waiting for a formal processing by the state apparatus. She was a perfectionist. When she realized that her hidden order was compromised, she applied the most radical form of structural cleansing, the complete thermal annihilation of her own archive. She had doused the corridor of the East Wing with an accelerant and ignited it. Through the armored viewing window of the door, Kretschmer saw the hallway transform into a roaring orange tunnel. The heat transferred rapidly to the white-painted steel of the door. The paint began to blister and popped off with a quiet crackle. The medical officer was aware that the hundreds of liters of formaldehyde and high-proof alcohol in the specimen jars behind him represented a ticking chemical bomb. As soon as the room temperature reached the flashpoint, the cell would be torn apart in a massive deflagration. There was only one way out: brutal, uncontrolled kinetic energy. Kretschmer laid the girl on the tiled floor, as far away from the shelves as possible. He reached for the heavy, rolling instrument table made of solid chrome steel. With a bone-chilling scream that tore through the months of prescribed silence in this room, he rammed the table against the viewing window of the door. The thick, bulletproof glass did not crack on the first impact. Kretschmer took a running start and rammed the steel frame a second, third, fourth time against the hatch. His hands bled, his muscles burned. The immense heat on the outside of the door finally weakened the molecular structure of the glass. With a dull crunch, the armored window gave way and shattered into thousands of sharp-edged fragments. A cloud of acrid black smoke shot instantly into the cell. Kretschmer did not hesitate for a second. He forced his right arm through the shattered opening. The jagged edges cut deep into his coat and flesh, but he groped blindly for the heavy, iron outer deadbolt. The metal was glowing hot. With a desperate yank, he pulled the lever upward. The door burst open. A wall of heat and smoke hit him. Kretschmer hoisted the limp body of number 44 onto his shoulders. Crouched under the thick blanket of smoke, his eyes narrowed to thin slits, he stumbled into the burning corridor. The flames were already licking at the wooden ceiling paneling of the old gallery. The deafening roar of the fire drowned out the bursting of the first formalin jars in the pathology lab behind them. Kretschmer carried the girl through the inferno, blind from smoke and pain, driven by nothing but the pure, unbridled will to survive. As they burst through the heavy fire door at the end of the gallery and stumbled into the icy, snow-covered courtyard of the Waldhaus, the East Wing exploded. A dull, massive detonation shook the foundation of the building as the chemical preservatives ignited, transforming the entire wing into a blazing ruin. Kretschmer collapsed in the snow, protectively burying number 44 beneath him. The ice-cold night air of the Harz cut into his lungs. When he lifted his head, he saw the lights go on in the main building. From the windows of the dormitories, dozens of pale, expressionless faces stared out into the night. None of the inmates screamed. None panicked. They stood in perfect, ordered symmetry at the windows, silently watching the burning grave of their comrades. The historical file 218 Ferv concludes with the police protocols of the following weeks. The arriving gendarmerie from Goslar found the Waldhaus in a state of absolute eerie order, with the exception of the completely gutted East Wing. There was no trace of Director Helene von Schutz. She had vanished in the night, and with her, the private, gray ledger that Kretschmer had lost during his escape. The official investigation report, signed by high-ranking officials of the responsible board, reads like a masterpiece of bureaucratic cover-up. The fire was officially attributed to a defective coal heating system. The heavily charred bone fragments and melted glass found in the rubble of the basement were declared to be the remains of an old, improperly stored anatomical teaching collection from the imperial era. A state educational home could not be a slaughterhouse. What was not in the file had never existed. Dr. Martin Kretschmer tried for months to bring the truth to the press. Consequently, he was dismissed from government service due to severe post-traumatic delusions and forced into early retirement with a minimal pension. The remaining girls of the Waldhaus were distributed to other institutions throughout the Republic. Their personnel files noted without exception that they were characterized by outstanding calmness and unconditional obedience. They never spoke about the nights in the Harz. They hardly spoke at all anymore. The director had vanished, but her methodology had triumphed. The girls had been molded into perfect, empty shells. Inmate number 44 survived that night physically unharmed. The files do not record her real name. There is only one final brief note from an institution doctor from the year 1961. It describes a young woman who sits silently by the window of a closed ward every day from sunrise to sunset. If she is given a task, she sorts pebbles on the windowsill for hours. Her hands move in a perfect mechanical rhythm. Grasp, examine, place. An endless loop, trapped in the invisible prison of the Waldhaus, whose walls never collapsed in her mind.